Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Katerji show. I'm Katerji, and this is my show. I have just been out at a protest in Kyiv, the first significant signs of public dissent against Zelensky since the full-scale invasion. So some of you might have been seeing that on my Twitter or Blue Sky or Threads or wherever you follow me. I've just got in from that, having filed for TVP World. So it's been a bit of a hectic day so far. It's been a busy day in Kyiv, actually. So I'm not across everything that's happened in Syria over the last 24 hours. But this is a Syria show. And we've got Aymenn Al-Tamimi, who's a researcher and analyst, who's going to talk to us a bit about what's been going on in the south of Syria over the last few days. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Hello, Red Kiova. Hello, Dave from next door. Hello, Random Shot in the Dark. Hello, RGB, RVB. Cheers, guys. Thanks for tuning in, as always. If you're following us along on Twitch, thanks so much for tuning in live. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the follows if you don't follow me yet. And also really appreciate you if you're following along on YouTube, watching this. I know more of you watch on YouTube. So if you are one of those people, please do like and subscribe because more of you watch than actually like and subscribe. And I know that growing the channel is really something that we need to do to keep bringing you these shows week in, week out. So thank you so much for tuning in. We've got two back-to-back Syria episodes this week, tonight with Aymenn Tamimi, tomorrow with Charles Lister, and then on Thursday we've got a Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump special with the multiple award-winning Pulitzer Award-winning journalist James Ball. He'll love me saying that, but I can't wait to have him on the show and talk to him about why the Epstein files are destroying Trump's base. But tonight we're going to be focused on Syria. We're going to do the same tomorrow. We're going to bring some different perspectives. It has to be said that a lot of Syria analysts are disagreeing at the moment quite publicly. Some of the coalitions that existed during the Syrian revolution are fragmenting now that we're in a post-conflict era, or are we in a post-conflict era in Syria? A lot of violence has taken place over the last few months. Some of it that the government may be involved in, some of it that other groups may be involved in. It's all rather murky right now, and there's a lot of anger amongst Syrian activists who for years were united. Look, we want to dive into that, find out what's been going on, find out who the perpetrators are of these atrocities that we've clearly seen taking place in Syria, which are awful to see. Again, the tragedies of the Syrian people continue. So we'll try and find out what's been going on over the next couple of days, and we'll try and get some more Syrian guests on to try and explain the situation. That'll be hopefully over the next few weeks. We'll keep trying to come back to Syria. But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. And without further ado, I'll bring my guest on, Aymenn Tamimi. Hello, Aymenn. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I've still not forgotten the time that when the Assad regime was collapsing and we were trying to work out, how far exactly is this going to go? I think I still owe you a meal though, because I thought it wouldn't quite go as far as the full collapse of the regime, and it was just such an uncertain time. So
you do
not forgotten that, my friend.
You do. I said you're going to owe me dinner, and you do owe me a dinner. Okay, at least you remembered that because I'd forgotten. So I'm glad you've got that. So listen, not everyone's going to be familiar with you. Why don't you just give us a bit of your background, just a small bit, and then we'll dive into basically what's been going on. And I know some of the things that you've said about it have caused some ripples on social media, but you're no stranger to that. So we will try and address that. But yeah, let's dive in. Who are you, Aymenn, and why should we listen to you?
Well, I'm not Syrian myself. I am of Iraqi background, but I was following the war in Syria from its outset, and actually since the regime fell, I I connected with a very lovely Syrian girl and interested in medieval history like me, and I got married to her actually just last month. So I have been in Syria actually.
Mabruk. Yeah, we know
thank you.
you're streaming to us from Syria tonight, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so from Kiev to Damascus, right? We've got.
Yeah, normally I'm based around in the Aleppo area of Syria. So I published. I did write extensively about the war and the different sides that were fighting. Most people know me best actually for the research on Islamic State that I did, particularly about its internal and administrative structure based on internal documents, translating, analyzing them, authenticating them. But I did also cover other aspects of the conflict. I don't think it's actually healthy or good to just be monomaniacally focused on one side, on say jihadism, which I think tends to be a bit of a problem just say one side or another. I tried to cover all different sides, whether it was the Kurdish-led SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, and also crucially the various factions that emerged in the primarily Druze province of Sweida. That's been the focus of all this fighting. I mean, I've seen a lot of inaccuracies that do emerge within the media coverage about this, and I think the problem is it's not necessarily malicious. It's just that it's a lot of people weren't really following Sweida closely before this year, so they're not necessarily familiar with all the different names of the different factions and who the various figures of significance in the province are, or why there's this fighting that's been going on. So I hope today we can actually just unpack some of that a little. And yeah, analysts do definitely have differing perspectives on what precisely has gone on. But for me, it's not really about viciously attacking anyone or being I think it's really just my concern has been that if as analysts we are inaccurate in our discourse, or that we find ourselves echoing crude talking points, we can risk actually just adding to the tensions, and when we don't need that at all. We need de-escalation right now, and hopefully things are going in that direction at the moment.
So look, also there's this new report that's been out by the Syrian Transition Government into the massacres that happened in the coastal regions. And we want to dive into that as well, because it does play into what's happening in the south. Not everything is at the feet of the government, but some of these atrocities can be linked towards government-aligned groups, and without accountability, Syria risks falling straight back into the whole reason why the conflict erupted in the first place was that Assad's violence against his own people. But look, can you give us a primer about what's happened in South Syria, not just over the last, say, 2 months, but take us back to at the end of the regime's life, and the start. Sweida's independence has been a reality for a while now, a de facto reality rather than a de jure one. How have we reached this point, and who are some of the factions involved? Because I've seen a lot of coverage from, I don't want to point fingers at specific people who should know better, but I have seen a lot of coverage basically making it out as if this is a one-sided ethnic sectarian assault on the Druze by the Al-Sharar government, shall we say. That is clearly not the case. However, there have also, which muddies the waters, there have also been clearly signs that, forces aligned with the Syrian Transition Government have blood on their hands in some of these atrocities. So again, it's one that has elements of truth in it, and people picking on certain parts of it are at a risk of not being able to present the whole picture of what's been taking place. And what's been taking place is a multitude of different things clashing with one another. Firstly, who is Hijri? Who does he represent, and what are his interests, and what is his background? If we can dive into that, we can start unpacking some of what's been going on.
So I just think a bit of background, actually, we need to go a bit further back than when the regime fell. It's actually go a bit further back to the war, during the years of the war itself. What actually happened in Sweida province? So Sweida province, primarily Druze, but also has Sunni minorities, also has Christian minority. Sweida, throughout the war, remained, formally speaking, de jure speaking, under the control of the Assad regime. In practice, what happened is the Assad regime kept a relatively light footprint within Sweida province from quite early on, actually. What I mean by that is that they would not, they were not heavily garrisoning Sweida with army divisions, Republican Guards, and all their other formations. They needed to go fight elsewhere in the country and actively try to suppress the insurgency, whether in Daraa or in Damascus suburbs or in Aleppo. So there was this relatively light footprint. Within that vacuum, you had a variety of different factions emerge within Sweida, primarily Druze factions. Now, the Druze spiritual leadership within the province, the three most highest spiritual leaders, called the Mashayikh al-Aql. For most of the years of the war, not just Hikmat al-Hijri, as some people make out, actually all three Mashayikh al-Aql. For most of the years of the war, they de facto stood by the regime in the sense that, they would make statements in support of the regime. They would say that, we don't want the collapse of the Syrian state, the attacking state institutions as red line. And that was actually a key factor in why the province didn't really see an armed rebellion like you see in other parts of you saw in other parts of Syria. And then within that vacuum, as I mentioned, different factions emerged. There were a variety of orientations. Some were pro-regime, some were Assad loyalists. The biggest example in Sweida was the National Defense Forces, which had some Iranian backing for a time, but then eventually that support actually by 2018 had withered away, and basically National Defense Forces in Sweida were forced to fund themselves, and they were complaining about about not getting members not getting salaries. But they were pretty prominent in Sweida. They're not there anymore. Once the regime collapsed, that's the end of the National Defense Forces, and so they're out of the picture. What you did have was what you might call a third way trend of factions that emerged, beginning with what is called the Rijal al-Karama movement, or Men of Dignity movement. Was founded by Sheikh Wahid al-Balous. There's a bit of retroactive financing now that says that he was a revolutionary all along. It was a bit more complicated than that. He was basically a third way in the sense that he wanted to make sure there was an protection for Druze who didn't want to serve in Assad's military outside of the province. His view was that if someone wants to serve in the military, this should not be a matter of conscription, it should be a matter of choice. And so Druze who wanted to evade military service, they could turn to this movement. He also, I think, was a sense of, he felt that, the Druze needed their own protection, both against potential transgressions by the regime's security apparatuses, but also by the rise of Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra at the time. This is 2013, 2014, 2015. And then he also, I think also, in the long run, he wasn't necessarily pushing for the downfall of the regime, but he had this kind of reformist agenda. So the way the Rijal al-Karama movement would present itself, and presented itself throughout the war, was, we're neither loyalists nor oppositionists, but we are patriotic Arab nationalists and humanitarians.
But also within Sweida, there was protests against the regime, and it was the only place within Syria where there were any kinds of Daraa as well, but Daraa is a kind of different case because the regime didn't want the protests to happen in Daraa, whereas there was kind of like an agreement with the Sweida tribes that they would just stay out of it, at least towards the latter end of the regime's life.
So Rijal al-Karama's founder was assassinated in 2015, and that's suspected to have been the work of regime loyalists. And I think that's very likely what happened. No one ever claimed the attack, but it was. I could see at the time that regime loyalists.
It was widely pinned on the regime.
Yeah. So, despite that, though, Rijal al-Karam maintained its third way position, and from within that, because of that, you did actually see later on the emergence of some more pro-opposition Sweida factions, like Wahid al-Balu's sons, Laith and Fahd, broke off from Rijal al-Karama and set up this thing called the Al-Karama Guest House, to which some local factions in Sweida became attached. And then over the years, too, you did see more and more opposition faction, more pro-opposition factions emerge. They weren't aligned with the opposition and the insurgency in the north necessarily, but they were more explicitly opposed to the regime. It was really 2023 when you saw the pro-opposition trend in Sweida get more momentum with the protests that broke out against the regime, because the living situation in the regime held areas was deteriorating so badly with the depreciation of the Syrian pound. I think fairly you can say that sanctions had something to do with that, in the sense of isolating the Assad regime. And then, as the regime finally collapsed, eventually all the factions in Sweida decided, yeah, we don't want the regime anymore either. So they helped dismantle the regime within Sweida province. And then since that time, though, with the fall of the regime, the de facto situation you had in Sweida, where Druze factions, local Druze factions, were primarily responsible for security, that is a situation that has largely endured. And then what you've seen from that is a division of, you have basically two main trends that have emerged among those factions in Sweida since the fall of the regime. On the one hand, you have factions that have been more pragmatic in the way they want to deal with the central government, or they have been at least until now. You've had some factions that think, well, look, we may have reservations about Ahmed al-Shara, the nature of the new government. Let's just try to talk to it and see if we can see what arrangements we can make. And that was the position Rijal al-Karama took. There's a position Laith al-Balous took. It was also the position of another prominent group in Sweida called Liwa al-Jabal, the Mountain Brigade. They also took that view. On the other side, you had a more, less compromising position represented in Hikmet al-Hijri and factions that say they follow him. I just want to stress, he's not a militia commander. He doesn't command these militias. But you have a bunch of factions in Sweida that say, we like Hikmet al-Hijri's positions and we follow his stance. And his position is that basically that the government, his basic position is that to get a final status resolution with the government for Sweida, he wants the government to guarantee decentralization and secularism within the constitution. And other Druze in the province would have said until now that, the more pragmatic ones would say that's not really a realistic position. And they felt that his positions were really obstructing the negotiations and resolutions. But so that is the situation we had until now, with the clashes of these different divisions, of what these different factions were and what they stood for. But in short, with the fighting that actually emerged, all the main factions really, except Laith al-Balous, who ended up leaving the province, all of them actually joined in with this, what they saw as a necessary self-defense effort for the Druze community against what they saw as invading forces, actually, to use the language of Rijal al-Karama there. Firstly, represented in the Ministry of Defense and Interior Forces that entered into the province, and then secondly in the tribal militias that mobilized from different parts of Syria and streamed into Sweida province.
So can you talk to us a little bit about what you think happened, at the start of this? And, we saw atrocities, violations committed on camera. We've also seen a lot of misinformation. We've seen those same militias, the Druze militias, also commit a fair share of atrocities against Bedouin civilians. We've seen Bedouin tribes then, go into Sweida to retaliate, or they're already in Sweida. But again, we've seen various different sides get involved in the conflict, and also then the Israelis went as far as bombing the Ministry of Defense on air. This was a major move by the Israelis, which seemed to have shocked even the Americans at the time. Haven't seen as much involvement from the Israelis since then. But look, where did this start? How did the violence erupt? And who is responsible for that? It can be more than one party. It doesn't have to, obviously, we all understand that. But to move Syria forward effectively into a post-conflict space, the people that commit violations need to be held accountable. The first chance to do that is to, find out who the perpetrators are, to name them. And then once we've, tried to understand that, we can talk about the Coastal Report and what's happened since then. When it comes to whether this Syrian Transition Government, we'll call it that for now, and that's what it calls itself. We will give it that leeway at least. But again, can this government be trusted to investigate its own actions, or investigate the actions of people that are allied to it? And how does al-Sharaa keep all of those, very belligerent factions that he managed to keep under control in Idlib from it? Or, again, the question that critics will say is, does he want to stop this at all? He is someone that has blood on his hands himself. Maybe he wants these kinds of atrocities to be committed. So talk us through, where did the violence begin? Who is responsible? And how do we move forward from that?
So it actually started as this round started as a local thing, that a Druze businessman was on the Damascus-Sweida route, and he was returning, and he was robbed and beaten. And what happened in response was that some Druze militiamen within Sweida retaliated against members of the Bedouin community within Sweida city. And then members of the Bedouin community retaliated it was a tit-for-tat kidnappings. And then it evolved into armed clashes. It resulted in a significant number of dead on both sides. What the government decided to do was, before this incident, the government had more or less stuck to an understanding that it would not send in external military or security forces into Sweida, based on a common demand of Suwaida's Druze factions in particular. What they then decided to do was to deploy forces into Sweida, actually contrary to that understanding. They moved into the north and west of Sweida countryside. Local Druze factions mobilized to respond to that. So you did have a night of fighting. And then initially, because the government has the superior manpower and firepower, initially the Druze factions and spiritual leaders, all three of the Mashayikh al-Aql, actually, they decided that, okay, this is a losing battle. Let's give the government forces who have entered a chance. Let's welcome these first. We welcome their entry. Welcoming, I put that in quotation marks there, because it was, to be fair, something that actually came from military pressure from the government. There was this openness for a bit to having discussions potentially, and there were meetings with there was a meeting with the Syrian government's Sweida security official, Ahmed Al-Dalati. He met with some of the local faction leaders and met with some of the spiritual leaders and notables too. But basically, from the moment the government forces did enter Sweida, there were these reports that emerged of violations. And the specific claim is that the government forces continued to commit those violations even after the statement came out saying we welcome their entry and, let's cooperate and coordinate with them. And on that basis, Hikmet al-Hijri was the first to come out and say that these violations have been ongoing, and that there needs to be a mobilization to stop what they call this barbaric campaign on Sweida. He was the first to come out with it, but very quickly also the other faction leaders too actually ended up mobilized against the government forces. And basically it just completely all collapsed from there. So the perspective I got from Liwa al-Jebel's leaders, Liwa al-Jebel, remember, as I mentioned, was one of the more pragmatic factions. He felt that it wasn't acceptable in his view for Ahmed al-Dalati, for example, or the government officials to say nice things about coordination, but then violations are being committed by forces of the Interior Ministry and the Defense Ministry. And also the perception that then became widespread among the Druze factions was in the end that these forces haven't come to, de-escalate something. They've come to support the Bedouin militiamen who are fighting us, and they've come to support they've come to impose their authority contrary to understandings, and we have to defend ourselves against these violations. Of course, that was a bit difficult to pick out from a lot of the reporting done about Sweida, or particularly if you only followed Syrian state media, or even a lot of external analysts. They were just portraying it as a fight between Hijri's militias, quote unquote, and then the government forces. And I get some people who were saying that were trying to be well-intentioned to say that this is not a Druze-Sunni sectarian conflict. But the reality is that there were other Druze factions, not just factions proclaiming loyalty to Hijri, who were and have been participating in this fight against both the government forces, who then were also subjected to Israeli strikes. And I think those Israeli strikes are actually quite an important factor in compelling an initial withdrawal of government forces. But then also subsequently, all these factions, again, not just Hijri's militias, were fighting the tribesmen who streamed into the province to fight against these Druze factions in the name of supporting Bedouins, civilians who had been subjected undeniably to abuses and violations by Druze factions, just as Druze civilians had been subjected to violations by government forces. So really, I don't actually buy the claim that this was all just something sabotaged by Hikmet al-Hijri, because even Druze factions in the province who were critical of Hijri actually have blamed the government for this, and then said that we were compelled to fight in self-defense. And basically, my view is, I think the government had an opportunity to show that it could, to show Hijri to be wrong, and say that, and to show the fears of the Druze factions that were wrong, that the government can come in, impose order, and without violations, and help actually bring security, because the province is really in need of security. It does need to relate to the central state and to relate to the central state security forces in some way. It needs to relate to the defense and interior ministries in some way. But unfortunately, that opportunity, I think, was squandered by lack of discipline in the government's forces and violations. Unfortunately, that has continued a pattern from the coastal region, like the village of Arza in Hama, in Jaramana and Ashrafiyat al-Sahnaya. And it doesn't have it doesn't have to be this way. There are places where minority communities live in Syria and they are protected by the security forces, and security forces behave with all professionalism. I don't just say that to flatter the government. It's actually just true. Anyone who wants to be objective about it can go to those minority communities, say in Aleppo, and see that the security forces there behave professionally. And if only that were actually able to be replicated elsewhere, it could actually help to bring a resolution that does actually really see the government properly impose its authority in a way that also wins the trust of the population of Sweida, for example.
Well, look, I wanted to talk about Israel's role in all of this, but I just need to take a quick break. It'll be about a minute long, so I'll just put you on the break screen, and I'll catch you for a second. But before I do that, before I go to our short break into proceedings, I want to talk about Ozzy Osbourne. Rest in peace, a real legend. He's just died tonight, so it would be unfair to mark the show without talking about one of the greatest to ever party, and my namesake there, the last great Ozzy. So thank you very much, Ozzy Osbourne, for all of your work. We really appreciate it, and rest in peace to a real one. And I'll catch you guys in about a minute. Okay. And we are back. Thank you very much for waiting there. Appreciated. So Israel are quite vocally supporting the Druze, as they say. In reality, the Hikmat al-Hijri aligned factions, as it were. Now, Hijri himself is a character who supported Assad quite visibly. Allegations, very, very serious allegations, ones that are substantiated, that he has involvement in the Captagon trade as well. So, can you talk to us a little bit about Israel's involvement here, and who are they getting involved with, and even some of Israel's biggest defenders in the United States have come out against this action by Israel, which they see as inflaming the situation in Syria, which the US, Washington, is trying to de-escalate. So what has Israel's involvement been? And as you said, it may have triggered a response from the government to pull out, but following that pullout, we also saw more violations committed in the security vacuum. So can you tell us a little bit about Israel's involvement and how it's impacted the dynamic of the situation on the ground?
Yeah, so the Israeli role, this is also something that, for context, we need to go a bit back before Assad fell. Basically, the Israeli view of the Druze community in Syria developed during the war. The establishment's view is that they felt they owed the Syrian Druze an obligation of protection in some way, because and the primary reason for this actually is that Israeli Druze, serving the IDF, Israeli Druze spiritual leaders, who have ties to the Israeli government, that they lobbied to the government and said that we care, we're concerned about our brethren over in Syria. This is during the war, before Assad fell, and so please, help us to protect them. And the Israelis felt that okay, then that they feel like they owed something to the Israeli Druze community. And now I get that some people will be skeptical of that, but that this really does exist within Israel, and what influenced the government's thinking. A good example of this is that during the early years of the war, you'll remember that there was widespread talk about Israel supporting rebels over on the other side of the Golan Heights. And there's some truth to that. There are some factions that Israel supported. such as the Forsan al-Jolan group, who were based in a village just opposite the Golden Heights, the occupied Golden Heights.
I mean, I should specify that the allegation that exists is that Israel was supporting Al Qaeda. That's what the allegation that exists on the online space, and it's so preposterously. The events that we're witnessing now really should put paid to that idea. But it still exists amongst the, if it's possible to be a Zionist Al Qaeda, somehow the online space has allowed for this to exist. But yes, as you said, Israel had relations with a very small militias in the south.
So to explain the logic behind that, which was that Israel basically saw that as necessary, as in its strategic interest to create this buffer zone, a de facto buffer zone, to keep away Iran and Hezbollah from the border. By having de facto rebel control, you keep the Iran and Hezbollah away from the border. There was an exception to that. There was a notable exception to that policy of supporting rebel control on the other side of the Golden Heights, which is the village called Hadar, which is a Druze village just opposite Majd al-Shams, Druze village in the Golden Heights. So Hadar is opposite on the Syrian side. And, Hadar was staunchly, was under regime control throughout the war. They claimed more than 130 martyrs, to use the language, of civilians and people who died fighting on the side of the regime. And this included actually some people from Hadar who were recruited by Hezbollah. One example being an individual called Meshkur Zaidan, whom the Israelis assassinated in 2019. Now, the logic, again, of keeping Iran and Hezbollah away from war would suggest that they would simply just let the rebels take Hadar. But their logic, the Israeli approach was, well, yes, we support the rebels on the other side of their control, but we won't let them take Hadar because we don't want to upset the Druze community in Israel. So that is really an example of why people really need to look before Assad fell as well. Look at that historical context to see where this Israeli policy about protecting Syrian Druze comes from. You can see it as a very misguided policy and one that does inflame tensions. It's a very reasonable view, but it doesn't mean they don't actually think that they're trying to help the Druze community in Syria. And then since the regime fell, they've continued to promote that logic, that policy of wanting to protect Syrian Druze, and it's been encouraged by statements by Hikmet al-Hijri and his supporters that they want international protection. That doesn't mean they want to separate from Syria, but basically, if they think that Israeli intervention or help protects the Druze community, they say, well, we welcome it, and even though they would welcome it also if it came from other neighboring states too, like Jordan, or it came from Saudi Arabia, or came from the Emirates. I remember the head of the Sweida military council, which is one of these pro-Hikmet al-Hijri factions, that actually emerged after the fall of the regime. I remember he told me that in his view, what Syria needed to do in terms of building its alliances, it needed to turn to the Arab states like Emirates and Saudi, and not Turkey or Afghanistan. I mean, that's ridiculous. The Taliban is not a major supporting ally of the new Syria. It is too far away to provide meaningful support. But basically, his point being that he felt that Syria should have those should have deeper ties with the Gulf states and not with Turkey, and he's concerned about the Islamist orientation. And then in terms of about Israel, he was circumspect, wasn't explicit, but he was saying, we welcome help. We don't want problems with neighbors, and we welcome good relations with neighbors. So they're not hostile to Israel, and if they feel Israel provides, if they think Israeli help, or whether in the form of military strikes now or an aid, helps the Druze community, then they think it, they endorse it. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that that's a conspiracy that's a conspiracy to split off from Syria. But I think it is more reasonable to say that support for Israeli intervention is naive and it actually doesn't serve the interests of the Druze community. And there were other factions, at least, and say the more pragmatic Druze factions I mentioned, who felt that we don't need Israeli support, and it actually is not. One guy from Liwa al-Jebel, for example, he said it's already all just propaganda. When Israelis are killing people in Gaza, why should we trust them?
I mean, it's an important point to bring up because it's also inflaming tensions with the new Syrian transition government and its supporters, who will see, the Hijri plans and say they are aligned with Israel and Israel is bombing us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So rather than making things necessarily from the Israeli perspective better for the Druze in Sweida, by inflaming the situation, they are making those people more likely to become targets of retribution from forces aligned to the government who are angry at Israeli strikes on Syrian territory. That's not to say that the rights or wrongs of that, but that is the reality on the ground when Israel involves itself in this way. One of the other things I'd like to highlight to you as well in seeing that unfold is that we saw a lot of the Israeli voices who were saying that they were intervening to protect the Druze when, for example, the images of mustaches being shaved were being shown on social media. Those same voices haven't at all mentioned the fact that there were atrocities committed by those Druze militias against women, children, Druze, Bedouin women and children, that we've seen the images of that. It's been, again, a very muddy situation to try and talk about, but Israel trying to, champion one side in this and champion itself in this is, in fact, exacerbating an already difficult situation in the south of Syria.
I did want to add that I think that this is also where the squandered opportunity is. That the government did have the opportunity to say that Israel is wrong. To say to the Druze community, you don't need Israel to protect you. We can impose order. We're here to just impose order, and we can do it, and we can work together. But the violations did, unfortunately, squander that opportunity. And I did mention the Israeli strikes. I think they were militarily actually quite important in inflicting significant losses on the government and compelling that initial pullout that before the tribal militias started streaming in. And then that intervention by Israel, I think, actually has bolstered its profile amongst the Druze in Sweida, that actually they think, they did this actually protected us from being completely overrun by the government. So unfortunately, I think the Israeli intervention in that regard has actually bolstered its standing, and that probably in the long run again does inflame tensions. And again, this is unfortunately, I think, where the squandered opportunity is, and I really wish it were otherwise.
So let's talk about the report that the government has published today about the coastal massacres. Again, it would be helpful if you could give us a primer about what happened, to start with. Again, it's another situations where the government, the Syrian Transition Government that I'm talking about, people be angry that I'm referring to them as a government, even though they're not elected. My feeling on that is they said they need 4 years before they hold elections. So until that period, they have earned a stay of, and from my being on the ground, it feels like they have a level of popular legitimacy that existed at least up until this point. The coastal massacres, what's happening in the south, the massacres in the south, and some of what's been happening in at protests in Damascus have started to bring the strains on that. I will say that it's important to note that this is no longer Assad's Syria. A lot of Syrians have returned home with very high expectations for what they want their government to do. So, look, if you could talk us through what happened on the coast, and then talk about what the Syrian government said it would do in response to that, what this report does, how close to accountability is Syria at the moment for the actions of the currently aligned government factions? How important is that to the stabilization of Syria and moving it into a true post-conflict space, which it has not been able to do so far since the fall of the regime?
Yeah, so the coastal massacres, weren't just random people streaming in, let's go kill Alawites. It was in response to what initially happened was that Alawite insurgents, some definitely who were linked to the former Assad regime, attacked the security forces within the coastal regions. And, it was a serious attack. I mean, they killed a significant number of personnel, and they did overrun,
hundreds of personnel, right?
Well, yeah. And then what happened in response was that there was this there was this general mobilization declared. So both government forces, those attached to the defense and interior ministries, but also I think other armed groups and armed militias who were loyalists, loyalist in the sense of loyal to the new government, mobilized towards the coastal region, and they quite quickly suppressed the insurgency. But during the process, there were also a number of instances of killings of Alawite civilians on a sectarian basis, on the basis of revenge, and people who clearly had nothing to do with these insurgents who had launched this initial action. And there was definitely a very high death toll. I think it does probably go into more than 1,000 Alawite civilians having been killed as a result of this. And then the government did announce that it would form a committee to investigate what had happened. And then initially, but then its deadline for work was extended to a period of around 4 months. And this is now, we've had today the publicization of a press conference, announcing the completion of the report, handing to the presidency, and some of the findings from it, does confirm what was largely suspected, that the government forces that committed very serious violations. The problem is that we don't. They've mentioned that they've handed names of suspects to the for investigation, for legal investigation. But we really don't have a clear picture yet of who exactly is suspected of by the government of committing these atrocities. What are their roles? How are they linked to the central government at all? This is actually why before the report was released, you were having calls from human rights organizations saying, make the report public for transparency. And I personally I'm sympathetic and supportive of that idea. But I don't think the government is going to do that because maybe there's sensitivity, maybe they feel it would jeopardize investigations, and maybe if names get released, that these wanted individuals who are suspected of involvement, they might go into hiding somewhere, or so. Despite the release of the press conference, we're still quite far away from accountability about what's happened. I think at a minimum, you're going to need to see, just as the government has announced on many instances the arrest of individuals who were linked to the former regime, former Syrian regime army commanders, or people who worked, say, with the National Defense Forces, or people suspected of particular crimes under the former regime. You've seen announcements of that. You see their photos get publicized, their names get publicized. There has to be something similar, at least, some kind of public accountability showing that individuals suspected of involvement, of the arrest, detaining, and of individuals suspected of involvement in these massacres. And I think that's really just I do feel that some people who do comment on this, are, of course, particularly some external observers, are hypocrites who, they talk about minorities all the time, but they had very little to say to people who, lost relatives under the Assad regime or were displaced. And, it does almost feel sectarian bias from some of these people on the outside.
The very, very real sectarian violence that Syrian Sunni Arabs faced for decades under the Assad regime. Again, and it's been thrown under the carpet, because brushed under the carpet. The sectarian element of the Syrian civil war is something mainly Arabs talk about, but outside of that, it hasn't been really understood. The West was never interested in understanding Syria through a sectarian conflict. That was one thing. You know, the only element of it was ever talked about was Sunni extremism, and never that Sunnis were largely the victim of sectarian violence in Syria, but also in Iraq and other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at Bani As, for example, there was a very serious massacre there in 2013 of hundreds of Sunnis, and it was clearly of a sectarian nature. And you know, the
Al-Hula, that was the same as well.
The former regime did nothing to, you know, they didn't have a press conference or they didn't commission a committee to investigate what happened in Bani As and to say who was responsible. One of the guys suspected responsibility. He lived in Mihraj Oral of the Syrian resistance. He lived out his days till the end under the former regime. He's now in hiding somewhere. I don't know where, but he never faced accountability for that. And an Irish leftist magazine named Mihraj Oral their Person of the Year, I believe, in like 2014 or something. Like immediately, like the year after he'd committed the atrocity. Yeah. So it was, you know. That's tankies for you, right? But to get back to the point though about, you know, why is accountability important here? So it's not, for me, it's not really about, I don't like fetishizing groups of people on the basis say that they're a minority or a majority. I think it's really just important just to show for the new state to show to the population that, you know, it won't just let people or people with guns go and settle scores on a personal, tribal, clan basis, sectarian basis, whatever, without accountability, because otherwise you can't build trust with the wider population in the longer run. That's where I think the importance of accountability is. It's not for me about a specific sect or it's really fetishizing Alawites because they have esoteric beliefs or because they're a minority. No, it's about showing that you can the government needing to show that it can build trust with the population, regardless of sect or ethnicity, and that really needs to be done through seriously holding violators accountable, but also seriously regulating gun ownership and making sure you don't have this phenomenon of loyalist militias who can just mobilize and going on rampages, and that's actually, to come back to Sweida, that unfortunately was I think that a big mistake on the government's part, on Ahmed Ashara's part, was to go and praise the tribal mobilization of tribal militias towards Sweida, because that just did not help at all. It really inflamed the situation further and just led to further catastrophic fighting and a deterioration of the humanitarian situation there. That is, so for me, that's where accountability and state the monopoly of state use of force and violence needs to be to help build trust with the wider population, and that's what I would conclude on that issue. I can't hear you.
So obviously a lot of difficult things going on in Syria at the moment. One of the questions I like, you're in Syria. You spent a lot more time there than I have recently. What are the challenges that Al-Shara faces over the next 3 to 4 years? And one of the questions that I have found interesting is the popular legitimacy element, that despite what's happened in the coast and in the south, that by and large, Syria being an overwhelmingly Sunni Arab country, that he does have a buy-in from a large portion of the electorate, and he could theoretically win a democratic election should it be held. What has he got to overcome over the next few years to actually make that legitimacy stick, to actually be able to win an election? And do you think, from what you've seen there, that we are heading towards some sort of democratic transition? Or do you think, like many of al-Sharat's critics, that really this is going to be another flavor of dictatorship, albeit one that seems to have pivoted more Western facing in a kind of Saudi Arabia model more than or Egypt model more than a Tunisia after the fall, before the fallback, before the counter-revolution, kind of an Arab democracy with a democratically elected Islamist government?
Just tackle the last bit there first. Actually, that I would say, if I haven't met Al-Sharat, so I can't. Maybe I don't know him as well as some other observers who have met him. But my sense is, from people inside Syria, is that if you could think of one model maybe that Syria is heading towards, or that he aspires to, is to be like President Erdogan in Turkey. That I think that, I don't think he really wants to relinquish. He doesn't want to relinquish or lose the presidency as long as he's alive. But if he could secure that via electoral means, genuine electoral means, then he will. There doesn't have a problem with that. So I think that's the kind of model potentially heading under Al-Sharat. Something like Turkey in terms of how he relates to the state. Others, of course, will find that concerning, because there has been a lot of democratic backsliding in Turkey as the longer Erdogan has remained in power. But in terms of the challenges, I think one of the foremost one is really to show results economically. Yes, we've had the announcement of the lifting of sanctions. We've had, and there was a lot of optimism in Syria about that among everyone. When Donald Trump said, "I'm going to be lifting sanctions on Syria," but it's one thing to have that, and it's another to see results for it. And you still don't yet have the results for that. That's not entirely the government's fault. But there really needs to be major inflows of investment and cash to really boost the economy in Syria. One of the issues, for example, is the Syrian pound's such a low value, and public sector workers' salaries. They're going by them. It's very difficult to make ends meet, and the government's promised to raise salaries, but can it actually afford to do so? Does it have the resources to boost people's salaries, to improve standards of living? Does it have? And even talking in terms of security, one of the issues in Sweida, for example, is that the local police there doesn't have resources to be strengthened to help impose order within the province. Can the government get the funding to empower local police there, for example? The second issue, I think, also is really actually unifying Syria's territory, because you still have the Syrian Democratic Forces, for example, controlling almost a third of the country, and having a hold over key resources in the country. There isn't really yet a clear mechanism of understanding between the central government and the SDF about how the SDF is supposed to relate to the central state. And this is unfortunately where instances like what happened on the coast, what's happened in Sweida now, it likely, from the SDF's perspective, it makes them much less trusting of the government. Why should we hand over weapons, or why should we integrate into the state in a way where we effectively dissolve ourselves as an organization?
Well, yeah, if you're the Kurds right now, or rather the leader of the Kurdish factions, Mazloum Abdi, for example, you are thinking, there is no point in us trying to, make a peace with this government or join this government if they're going to treat us the way they've treated the situation in Sweida. However, there is also pressure coming. We have to remember the SDF existed or rather the YPG existed before US support, but the SDF basically exists today because of the amount of foreign, well, US more than anything. Yeah.
It's a coalition. It was a creation of the U.S. coalition to get around the issue of the YPG being this, the armed wing of the Syrian affiliate of the PKK, basically, and to try to broaden it out as a coalition. It is a broader coalition than just one party, but it is a one-party hegemonic system. It's a one-party-led system. It's dominated by the PYD and its armed wing, the YPG. However much they like to say that they are democratic, and really, it's a one-party-led hegemonic system. So but the thing is that regardless of that, it is the Syrian government has a burden to work out its relationship with the SDF and to try to actually, bring them really properly under the fold of the state in a way that, that minimizes bloodshed and is not likely to lead to lasting instability in the northeast of the country. So that's another major challenge. Another challenge I've seen also too is, that there's been a very serious drought this year, and that has very seriously impacted livelihoods, livelihoods of farmers. So really, there was, in the area I've been in, there was no real crop yields at all this year because of the rainfall. There was no rainfall at all. It just came at the wrong time. There was no real rain. A really serious deficit of rain in February and March. You had some heavy rain, but it was nowhere near enough. Came at the wrong time and doesn't compensate for the overall deficit. So the government's going to, I think, have to deal in coming years. This is going to be a bigger problem. Also, it's going to be probably an even bigger problem in the coming years, and that is a real. Agriculture is an important sector within Syria. And it's going to be a big challenge for the government to deal with, and to deal with issues like water resources. So, those are the main things that come to my mind right now. Yeah.
Well, look, we've also got a situation. We were talking about the SDF, and the SDF still, they have Al-Hol camp dealing with, families and people that lived in ISIS areas, ISIS-controlled areas before the SDF came in and took those over through American support. So part of this reconciliation with Damascus would be, solving the Al-Hol situation and having, the government take over. Because at the moment, the SDF are the ones who have to administrate what is, a large-scale security operation to deal with. And also, the big question is, ISIS still exists, obviously to a much more diminished capacity, but they still exist within Syria. And governing the country and will have to include a security element to prevent, elements like ISIS from being able to operate with impunity on Syrian territory. So can you talk to us about the threat that ISIS still poses and the security challenges that this government, even if it was to, let's say, get its rows in order, get the accountability for any government-aligned groups that have committed atrocities, that they are punished. It has reunified the territory. It's made a deal with the SDF. The SDF now have some sort of agreement in which they at least militarily administer their areas. What kind of future could we have over the next 2-3 years? But the situation with ISIS still exists, and the government is going to come up against that at some point. We have had indications that the US has already begun intelligence sharing with the Syrian Transition Government on certain ISIS activities. Also, the US is still on the ground there in Al-Tanf, right? What's the future of that, and what's the future of the sort of counter-ISIS coalition within Syria?
So with the IS threat, I think it's a twofold thing. First is fortunately, of course, with the rapid collapse of the Assad regime, you didn't see IS seizing large territories within Syria. But what they probably did do, the cells of the group did do, is that they exploited that collapse to move cells into new areas, to seize weaponry that had been left behind by the collapsing regime. And that's played out, I think, in some of these security operations the government carries out in different parts of Syria, like in Aleppo city. And when they talked about, so after that Mar Elias church bombing in Damascus, I'm pretty sure when the government did say that they'd found an IS cell and cracked down on it, whether or not it was linked to the church bombing itself, I have no doubt there are IS cells in the Damascus area. The second issue, I think, with the IS problem is that with the background of many of the insurgent groups that overthrew the Assad regime, particularly Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its background in Salafi Islam, and a bit of a rather sectarian view or Sunni-centric view, or view, that worldview that emphasize ideas of like implementing Islamic law. These are part of the original ideas of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham when it was founded. There's a risk that certain elements of people who are saying Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that they become disillusioned by direction, the more moderate direction you could say Syria is taken under Ahmed al-Shara, and then they decide that they think that IS is actually the real alternative.
This is sort of the rock and the hard place that al-Shara is caught between when he, even if you were to take him at his word that he wants to hold these people accountable, that if he does that, he risks pushing the more fundamentalist elements into conflict with the state, and that's something the state really doesn't want to deal with right now.
So an example of this is this group that calls itself Syria Sunnah, and they post claims about threatening Alawites, threatening Druze, claiming responsibilities for assassinations. They also claimed this Mar Elias church bombing. And the account that I understood from them about their origins, they claim as their origin, they claim their origin story, is they claim to have been in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham originally, the core of it, and that they broke off over disagreements about dealing with regime prisoners during the collapse of the regime, and also they felt that Ahmed al-Shara has not implemented Islamic law, and they feel that it's actually this government has fallen into apostasy. And they claim to have former HTS,
which is the ISIS view, basically, right?
Yeah, which is the same view as IS. Yeah, and so there is a risk, and IS is doing this in its propaganda. They've been reaching out, their messaging, they've been targeting, say, for example, foreigners who worked with HTS. They don't trust the HTS, don't trust Ahmed al-Shara's government to protect you. He will betray you in the end. And to appeal to people who felt maybe that HTS was working to implement Islamic law, but actually hasn't done that under this new government. So I think that the defections are also another risk that needs to be more in mind. And the Syria Sunnah, it could be they claim to be independent of IS, not to be actually working with it. They no doubt have they're no doubt pro IS, and they could also, of course, just be an IS front group. And so there's a risk also of defections to this. People who work in, say, the army or in the security forces defecting to IS or to this Syria Sunnah, and that just generates more security problems for the government. I think this is why it's particularly important for, I think, the external actors that engage with the Syrian government to have a closer oversight and know, how exactly are the new security forces and army being built? What is the ideological direction? What I don't mean view that somehow the people overseeing the military and security have this view of a transnational caliphate. There's nothing like that at all. But they need to be vigilant about what kind of vision of Syria is being given to to people being incorporated into the security forces and into the military. Is it a Syria for all Syrians, or is it really one of these problematic trends I think you see in Syria recently is this Umayyad populism trend, that tracing a lineage with the Umayyads in a way that really gives a Sunni-centric view of the state, and has actually been linked to sectarian acts, like, for example, this Shia shrine in Aleppo called Mashhad al-Nuqta that was converted into a Dar al-Wahi school for Quranic instruction. That's wrong. I mean, you don't go and seize people's shrines of other sects or destroy them and appropriate them like that. Just as we should be opposed, for example, if Shia militiamen go and take a Sunni mosque and turn it into a Husseiniya. That's not right. But the people who were doing that then claimed they're invoking its Umayyad populism in what they were doing. So I think this is the key thing. I strongly support the concept of critical engagement by external actors of the government. Not outright hostility, but then just not also just turning a blind eye to things. Have no oversight about what's going on in terms of the building of the new security forces, because that ultimately is just better for Syria. To have a security forces that you have some of the good examples in other parts of Syria, and just to make sure this is consistently applied, and it will just be better for everyone inside Syria.
Yeah, look, I agree with much of that. Again, it's a complicated situation, and if you'd have asked me, al-Shara would have definitely not been the person I would have chosen to lead Syria. But we are where we are now, and we have to engage with the reality on the ground. Those of us who said that there was no future for Syria under Assad and that the regime would eventually collapse were proven right by history. But this is the hard part. Even though it was 14 years of struggle against the regime, building a democratic Syria was always the hard part. It's always difficult to go from a dictatorship decades and decades. Syria's never known a true democracy. So getting to that place was always going to be difficult, and it's going to take a certain type of toughness to be able to do that. And al-Shara has marketed himself as that person, but history will judge whether he does that all over the next few years. Really, I think the big question for most of the Syrians that I know, and again, I'm Lebanese, so I don't want to speak with authority as a Syrian, because I can't do that. But the Syrians that I know, a lot of them are giving him the kind of benefit of the doubt up until the point of, are we getting elections? And many of them would even potentially vote for him. I know a lot of people, secular, who atheists even, that would vote for al-Shara in an election. That might blow the minds of people listening, but that's the kind of place that Syria is at the moment anyway. But the question will be, over the next few years, will there be accountability for violations, and will there be a genuine democratic transition, even if that democracy more mirrors, autocratic Turkey rather than, say,
Western Europe.
But again, I'm thinking I have to go to Western Europe, because you don't want to end up picking Hungary or Serbia, or it's not like there are countries within Europe that have significant democratic deficits so look, again, we're trying to analyze the situation, not trying to express support or sympathy for people that may end up very much on the wrong side of history, but we also have to give Syrians a fair chance at a future. They fought for 14 years to reach a place where they have a chance at a democratic transition that they would never have had under Assad. Now, look, we're at the point in the show where we're going to throw over to some user questions. We've got a question from Fisher for Alex. And also, listen, thanks to everyone who's been watching on Twitch tonight. Thank to you if you're watching on YouTube afterwards. Please do hit that like and subscribe and follow us along on Twitch. It really, really helps us grow. And yeah, really appreciate that, and really appreciate Aymenn for his time. We'll throw over to a few audience questions. So if you've got them, and if you haven't typed in the chat before, please do write something in the chat, throw a question up. We've got Fisher for Alex, who said, I heard another expert on foreign fighters in Syria that the fall of Damascus aligns strongly with their jihadist vision for the region, e.g. One domino has fallen, next will be Jerusalem, etc. Therefore, they are okay with the al-Shara government at the moment due to his role in executing their vision, but it's a pragmatic relationship that Salafi jihadists who are aligned currently with al-Shara don't necessarily see their future in kind of the Syria-centric, technocratic, Islamist governance that al-Sharaa has told the world he's trying to implement, rather than, again, whether that's what he's saying that he's trying to do, rather than what we're trying to claim that his position is. But again, what do you think of Fisher for Alex's question?
So the foreign fighters are a bit of a complicated issue, because some of them do just align with the government. They just, there are foreigners who've come to Syria who basically whatever the government says now, or whatever Sharaa does, they will basically support it. But there are others, I think, yes, who have a more, who don't have the same vision of, Syria being in the international order. They see Syria as one stepping stone for something else, like, future liberation of Jerusalem. Or good example is that Egyptian guy who was with HTS, Ahmed Mansour, who then announced this new movement to liberate Egypt from the Sisi regime, and he's just been arrested by he was arrested by the
very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the government, to be clear, I don't think these foreigners who have I don't think if any foreigners who have this concept of using Syria as a launching pad for operations outside of Syria, that's not going to carry weight with the government, at least under Sharaa. He was very clear for years, and always has been, that he doesn't want Syria being used as a launching pad by any group for external operations. Whether that's Al Qaeda, or whether it's even now the talk about relations with Israel. He clearly doesn't want Palestinian militant groups using Syria as a launching pad for operations against Israel. He wants to minimize those kinds of problems. So I don't think, though, that's not going to influence the government itself. But there is the possibility that some foreigners who do have that vision, do have that more transnational vision, who thought they would just throw in their lot with HTS, decide that this isn't what we were fighting for, and potentially, again, this is something that could lead to defections to IS, for example, or they could just end up quitting the field entirely. But my sense is, there are also just foreigners who will align with the current government, and are open, for example, to the idea of Syrian nationality. I remember one of the Uzbek guys was with HTS. I just said, if there's an opportunity for Syrian nationality, I don't see the problem with that. So there are also loyalist foreigners who will stand by, we're still standing by, and will stand by this government.
So look, there's a couple more dynamics I wanted to go to. We've got a question here from Spazalot. Always a pleasure reading that name out. He wants to know, have the Russians left yet? And we know the answer's no. But can we talk about the relationship between Damascus and Moscow, and also using that question as a launch pad to also talk about relationship between Damascus and Tehran? Effectively, what we've seen is Damascus being explicitly anti-Tehran government so far. In practice, in relations, there are no relations currently between Damascus and Tehran. But the situation with Russia has been more complicated, potentially due to the fact that relations with the West are not fully restored yet. And despite what, the Syrians were subjected to by, Russian bombardment, that they have a pragmatic view with it. Just like, it needs to be said that when al-Sharaa came in, the first thing to do wasn't to arrest everyone remotely tangentially involved with the regime. It was to allow the existing prime minister, if you can even call him that, to have a transition period. It seemed very as if it wasn't the sort of de-Baathification process that we saw in Iraq, for example, following the fall of Saddam Hussein. There seemed to be maybe some pragmatic lessons that al-Sharaa learned from his time in Iraqi prisons under the coalition about how to move forward with that. So, again, what's the relationship with Russia? What's the relationship with Iran? How are we with those moving forward?
So with the Russians, they still do have a military presence inside Syria and the main airbase in Latakia. And the new government, the government in Russia and it has shown a degree of pragmatism in terms of dealing with the new government. They're not going to be outright hostile to it, and they have been willing to engage with the new government at Ashara, and actually willing to ship things, to actually ship certain commodities that are in short supply within Syria. So there's that. But on the other hand, if the Russians wanted to improve their relations even further with the new government, they could hand over Assad for trial and accountability. But they're not going to do that. At least they've made it clear they don't want to do that. So that is actually a bit of a limitation on relations with Russia for the time being. But he doesn't want hostile. The new government isn't outright hostile to Russia. And
I will say sorry to interrupt there, but I will say that one of the criticisms from Arab nationalists is that he hasn't basically effectively declared war on Israel immediately after taking over, and therefore he's a traitor to. But without getting into the pathology behind that reasoning, it is something as an Arab you and I will have to encounter in conversation. However, one of the things to point back at that is saying, well, look, this is a group that fought a war against Russia for the best part of 10 years at least. And they're not declaring outright hostility with Moscow, despite the history. Yeah. So if they're able to do that with Moscow, then it shouldn't be so shocking that they're kind of saying to the Israelis, look, we don't want to fight you, but this is the complicated reality of this current government as it exists.
I think with the Iranians too, if the Iranians weren't hostile to the new government and they genuinely said that, we want to open a new page and we respect the sovereignty of this government over Syria and we're willing to help, if it was genuinely that conciliatory stance, there could, I think, be ties between the Syrian government and Iran. They wouldn't let Iran use Syria as a transit point for the resistance axis. But I think actually that very issue is one of the problems for Iran, is that Iran ideologically has been committed to this concept of the resistance axis and fighting Israel, and the Assad was a key linchpin for that resistance axis concept as a conduit, a supplier of weapons to Hezbollah. And so so I think that's, ideologically, the Iranian government is not good, can't actually move beyond that and say, maybe rethink the concept of the whole axis of resistance, and say, let's be done with this, and we're still a Shia Islamic Republic, but let's have a more realistic view of the region, and let's be friends. Let's try to be friends with the Syrian government. And if the Iranians could do that, they could maybe have relations with the Syrian government. But instead, it's really an outright ideological hostility. And
I think there's an economic element as well, is that the Iranians invested billions and billions, lines of credit to Damascus through oil, through fuel, through military support. They plow billions of dollars into Syria that they will never get back, and one of the first things they demanded of the Al-Shara government when he came into power, we were like, well, where's our money? We want all that money back. And Damascus was rightly like, absolutely no way. Are you crazy? Like, you're never getting that money. That seems to be a significant point between the two. Like, forget the atrocities and the violations and the war and the economic lifeline that Iran provided Syria was significant. It significantly impacted the amount of money Iran was able to provide its own people. All of that's gone, dismantled, along with the Hezbollah's trafficking network through Syria and Iraq. much of that has been dismantled by Israel now. So the economic situation that Iran is basically left on the hook for all of this money, that's got to be causing some friction with Damascus going forward, surely.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt, but I also do think the ideological element is there too, and the way that the Iranians talk about the new government is that they want it to be overthrown and the resistance, will return again. This is not conducive to having a good relation, and I think that's what this is. Again, I think when people debate Iran's actions in the region, ideology really does matter, in terms of how they frame this whole concept of acts of resistance and opposition to Israel. And so, unfortunately, unfortunately for the Iranians, then that means that I think there's really having establishing a friendly relationship again. It's really off the table. Establishing good relations with this government, it's really off the table unless Iran really seriously rethinks its own approach.
So look, we got a couple more questions, then we'll wrap it up because I know it's late there in Damascus. So two of these questions can be answered together. .ks is saying, with the recent events, is there a fear for the transitional government ending up in another conflict with the SDF or larger civil war across Syria again? I think we've touched upon that, about talking about with whether how the SDF feels about relations with Damascus, not so much talking about how Damascus feels about the SDF. So that's a question to you. But also, I'm Ran010, thanks for the question, first time chat, saying, do you expect the SDF issue to be resolved by the end of the year? So those two questions in .ks and I'm Ran010. And then we've got one final question after that, and then we'll call it a night.
I think with the SDF issue, this is not. I don't expect this to be resolved by the end of the year. I think the tone of the March agreement, which suggested there was an integration coming, it's not. It's very little has actually changed on the ground. You had this arrangement in Sheikh Maqsood and Ashrafia in Aleppo City. Those were isolated SDF. Those were isolated SDF-controlled enclaves. So it's difficult to really replicate that over the rest of the SDF-held, the core of the SDF-held territory. So I don't see this. And particularly what's happened in Sweida, and that is, I think, just further dampening the possibility of a resolution, of a real resolution coming by the end of the year. So putting a bet on this. If I'm wrong, I'll give you another dinner. I owe you 2 dinners. I will say that I don't expect a resolution of this of the SDF issue by the end of the year. Really, the SDF, as I say, what they strike me as wanting, and what I think they reinforce what they think is in their own interest, is that they want to relate to the central government in the way that Iraqi Kurdistan in Iraq relates to Baghdad, despite whatever denials they might make about that, because basically they want to still be the SDF and still have this autonomous administration. They want funding from the central. They just want the government to green light that, recognize it, and basically give it funding too. And I think that is not. If you look at the talk about integration, they say the SDF says we want to integrate as a bloc into the new Syrian state. What they mean by that is we want to integrate as the SDF and still be the SDF. But the government will say, no, we want your personnel to integrate as individual personnel and not as an SDF bloc. So it remains a thorny issue, and I don't see it being resolved by the end of this year.
Well, look, we've got one final question from Joel DBR. As Turkey's Erdogan's role has been so instrumental in maintaining the Idlib bubble for rebellion during the darkest days, I agree with much of that. I will say that.
No, it's true. I mean, if Turkey had not intervened intervened in the way it did in early 2020, there would not be.
That's the big one. It's not that the Turkey greenlit the collapse of the Assad regime. There had been outreach between Ankara and Damascus over those years, but it was the 2020 intervention which shocked the Russians. Before the Russians were like, well, the Turkey's never going to, and as soon as that, the Russians didn't push the Turks back. That was the limits of what Damascus realized it could do. Russia was not willing to risk its relationship with Turkey for Assad. So look, much of that was down to that. But we're digressing from the question. When the rebels were teetering on the edge of defeat, as well as in the current diplomatic moves and positioning, I'm curious, how do you view Syria's relationship, meaning Damascus's relationship, with their northern neighbors? To what extent do you view al-Shara as Pasha, dependent on and subservient to the new Ottomans? And I suppose within that lies a question of, is Erdogan's rule that stable for the next, decade even, given that there is a significant challenge to Erdogan's rule at the moment and the crackdown that he has been implementing against the opposition, the Kemalist opposition, in response to that. So how does al-Shara navigate that relationship with Ankara?
No, I think Turkey really is actually the main partner of this new government, militarily, economically. I mean, you can see this in the availability, just how readily available Turkish products are in the, say, parts of northern Aleppo that I've been to. Also, for example, for my house in Syria, I connected it to Turkish. I connected it to Turkish internet. Got someone to aim a satellite towards Turkey, so you get Turkish internet. I mean, people, it's really becoming widespread in northern Syria soon. And also connecting Syrian towns and villages and in the north to the Turkish grid. Hasn't happened yet where I got my home, but it is. There's talk that it's going to be coming there too. So the ties are I think they're going to continue to deepen. I think militarily too, it's going to happen. But to what extent, is not exactly clear yet. But I think you will have Turkish bases, I think, within the country, and direct Turkish involvement in training of and building of the new security forces. So I think, that at least as long as Erdogan is in power, at least you see a very, very strong relation between Turkey and Syria, but I don't see al-Shara as like a pasha or a subservient a client state of Erdogan. I don't quite see that view of Syria under al-Shara. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's no doubt there's a close alliance between the two countries.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Aymenn Al-Tamimi. If you want to learn more about Aymann's work, he's got a Substack. What's your Substack? You can let us know what your Substack is.
It's called Aymann's Monstrous Publications. But, it's AymannAlTamimi.com.
I will stick a link to that in the show notes. But thank you so much for joining us live from Syria. A really special show for you guys. You're getting to see people streaming live from Kiev and Syria. Again, something that probably wouldn't have been even imaginable only a few years ago, to be able to have a show like this presented with a guest calling in from Syria, or a part of Syria that would have been regime held at the time. So again, really, really fabulous to have you on, Aymenn. I'll put a link to your Substack, and thank you so much. Any final words you want to give us to the audience?
No, it's been a long conversation. I think my wife wants to end now.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right, well, good night, Aymenn. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So listen, that was Aymenn Al-Tamimi. Very pleased he managed to stay with us for so long. Appreciated that. It was a bit longer than some of our normal chats are. So look, today's been a busy day, obviously, with this protest in Ukraine, and we're going to try and bring you some news on that. We'll try and just let the situation develop and then bring you some more informed coverage rather than immediate reactions to it. We did that with Syria. We let the news, settle a bit and then come back to it this week. So we'll try and do that over the coming weeks with any kind of thing that's developing in foreign policy. Try and bring you some other interesting topics here and there. And yes, some British politics. I know that my foreign audience is not as much interested in British politics as I am, obviously, but do watch it. I promise you it's interesting. Britain is not the only country in Europe going through growth and economic difficulties at the moment. So some of the issues that we will discuss will have similar scenarios playing out in other parts of Europe, at least. So listen, thank you all, everyone that's watching on YouTube, on Twitch. Please, I know it sounds like a broken record, but please do like and follow and subscribe, because it really helps us grow. And really big thank you as well to those of you subscribing on Patreon, those of you who are following along and helping out, supporting on Coffee, through the Coffee page. That's really appreciated. It's basically just me at the moment, and I'm obviously, you see me posting, I was at the protest earlier, so I've worked a day shift already on the news, and I'm doing this at home, all on my own. We don't have a producer or anything at the moment. So if you support me, it's really appreciated, and I will use that, any money that I can generate from this, we'll try and invest, try and get a producer on, try and be able to do more shows and bring bigger guests on. But it's just, I'm starting out with this. I'm really enjoying it. That's the one thing I will say. I'm really enjoying this. We're doing this as season 1. I'll try and aim for 100 episodes in season 1, and then try and maybe consider a break, because it is pretty full on with my schedule. But I just want to say, like, having all of you guys talking to me and sending me messages, and even the ones who aren't typing in the chat, I know that you're watching in, week out. I can see your names in the thing. It really goes a long way to me, making me get up and continue to do this week in, week out. Really appreciate all of the support that we've had so far. Really want those numbers to keep growing. Again, I know most of you follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky. That's where you know me from. And I'm trying to reach out to new audiences here that isn't in the tiny echo chamber bubble that Twitter tends to be at times. So thank you for joining me on this journey. If you're new, if you've just heard of me for the first time and you're watching my video, please do consider hitting that little button and following along. It would really help grow the channel and bring you some more interesting content. Again, I would like to try and have a live element, at the protest. Maybe would have been good to try and stream from the protest. That's something I will consider doing as I grow the technical capabilities of the show. But again, thanks everyone. Thank you all. Noel, Fisher for Alex, Liquid Amber, Random Shot in the Dark, Joel, Spazalot, I'm Ran, all of you guys that have messaged .ks. Really appreciate all of the support that you guys have been showing for the show. I've got regulars who are in here week in, week out. I know, look, I chose Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday because there is kind of like a gap and there's not really that much going on. All of the cool shows that you want are out on Friday or whatever. So that kind of also, and I know that I might lose some followers here, but Manchester United, the football team that I support passionately, even if I don't talk about it as much as I used to for obvious reasons, we aren't playing in Europe this year. In Europe, European football, for those that don't know, happens on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday slot. So there's no European football for Manchester United. So there's never going to be any clash in which I have to stay up to watch the Champo. So that's not going to happen. So I thought, well, now that that's not going to be a distraction, I can focus on running the Oz Katerji show in both places that I've got the symbol for the next few months and try and bring you some interesting guests. As I said, I'm working through a list of people that I know IRL, which is really helpful. At some point, I'm going to run out of my list of friends and I'm going to need to dip into people that I don't know. So that's the bit that I'm worried about once we get to week 20 and week 25, what my guest list looks like then. The one thing is, I'm trying to do an interview show, right? I might end up doing more, personal one-on-one stuff, but really going to keep trying to bring you those interviews, because it's, I understand that streaming, from what I've experienced, I don't watch a lot of streams, but from my experience is that people tend to come on and talk a lot, just themselves and reacting to things, and I haven't really done much of that. And part of me is, because I'm a journalist, it's like, why would you want to sit and listen to everything that I have to say when I can bring out all of these really interesting people who have news to tell you about? So but again, I will start doing more of that as I start feeling more comfortable just rambling away on camera as myself. But if you've managed to stick along and you're still here right the way to the end of the video, we've been recording for 1 hour and 40 minutes. So if you're still sticking along, wow, really impressed by that. Thank you so much. I know that's a lot of your time to spend listening to one guy or two guys, as it were, talk. But can't thank you enough. Again, please do like and subscribe. Thanks to everyone who subscribes and sends money through Coffee and Patreon and so on. You guys keep the show going, keep it sustaining, and hopefully bring you some more interesting conversations like we have done over the last few weeks, right the way throughout the rest of the summer, and maybe into a bit of the autumn as well, and then maybe take a little winter break before considering coming back for season 2 and bringing you guys a whole bunch of new guests and new topics to talk about. One thing that I'm really interested in talking about is AI. I hate AI for many reasons, and I want to talk about how much I hate AI and how dangerous I think AI is becoming and will be. So I'm going to try and find a good AI guest. So yeah, do let me know if you've got any suggestions for someone to come on. AI is growing on you, Spaz, a lot. Well, I'm worried for that. Thank you for the donations, guys. I really appreciate it. But yeah, AI makes me feel quite Ted Kaczynski like, so maybe we'll talk about Ted Kaczynski as well. I'd really like to. We'll do a Ted Kaczynski episode. We'll do 10 Ted Kaczynski episodes over the course of the show. That's a promise. You can mark that. 10 Ted Kaczynski episodes before I shuffle off this mortal coil. Yeah, look, I mean, we could sit here all night talking about how bad AI is and how annoying it is, but I think there are more serious concerns with it becoming self-replicating that I have started to see serious experts talk about, and that's what I wanted to try and talk about. So yeah. Anyway, thanks. It's been a long evening here in Ukraine. As always, I've been Oz Katerji. This has been the Oz Katerji Show. If you do want to see more of us, please do follow along on those socials. And I bid you all a wonderful night. I don't know if you've noticed as well, we changed some of the camera settings and stuff, so it should look a lot nicer and should sound a lot nicer as well. So if you, I hope you guys have noticed the work that we've gone in to try and improve the technical aspects of the show. It's a work in progress. Thank you for bearing with us in the early days with the low follower count and the technical mishaps, experiments here and there. But yeah, thanks again, everyone. And I will see you tomorrow night. We'll have Charles Lister on. We'll be basically asking a lot of these questions again, but it's important to note that lots of analysts have different takes on what's been going on. So we're going to try and bring a varied range of voices on. I'm aiming to get more. I've reached out to some people. Haven't heard back from everyone yet, so yeah, hopefully get some more voices on for you to keep talking about Syria. Syria is certainly something we want to pay a lot of attention to going forward. But anyway, I've been Oz Katerji. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you tomorrow night, or if you're watching on YouTube, whenever, you can just watch all of the old shows so you can see me immediately afterwards. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.